I'd now like to introduce our first plenary session. This session is called Evolving World Trading System Implications for Business and will be facilitated by Dr Andrew Stoeckel, Honorary Professor, Centre for Applied Macroeconomic Analysis, Crawford School of Public Policy, Australian National University. Please welcome Dr Stoeckel.
Well, thank you very much. And John just mentioned then a few of the key challenges that are coming in the world environment. And they're immense. And I don't know that everyone really appreciates just how big they are. That we haven't seen, the world has not seen the extent of the global leverage before that we're seeing now. We have not seen the degree of interconnectedness. We have not seen the rate at which central banks are hiking interest rates, the rate at which it's going up. We have not seen the interlocking of some of the geopolitical tensions, and of course that's on top of a global pandemic which is still ongoing in China. The point is there is no historical precedent for those changes that are coming, and enormous changes are underway. Now, fortunately, the good news is we've got 5 really good speakers to help thrash out some of this and so on. And what I'm going to do first, because it's going to be a bit of a mixed session, because our first speaker, the former Trade Minister and current Shadow Minister for Immigration and Citizenship, Dan Tehan, has to go back to Parliament. So he's going to speak, and we're going to have a few questions and answers, then he'll leave. At that time, we have one video session, and we're going to play that, and then the other speakers, and then we'll be running a Q&A. So to save time, I'm just going to run through very briefly the key features of some of our speakers today. I just mentioned the Honourable Dan Tehan, and he'll be our first speaker. Now, important in that is that he deserves enormous credit because he participated in the release of the CACCI study on trade. So he's a key person who knows all about what CACCI is on about. But he's worked in trade, agriculture, and many posts, etc., including the Department of Trade, as you can see there. Our next speaker will be, from video, will be Henrik Isaacson, and he worked in the National Board of Trade in Sweden. He was a senior policy advisor there, and he'll be giving us a perspective on what is happening in European trade and so on. Now, the key thing to work and look for in his address is the weaponisation of trade and the regulatory morass that has instilled and is working through in the trade environment. Next, we'll have Brian Clark. Now, Brian was also, he's probably familiar to most of you because he was involved with the Australian Chamber, and he was an active member of that, and he was also very instrumental in the production and the organisation of the CACCI statement on trade, etc. So, and he'll be giving us a perspective on that. He's currently the Director at the Centre for International Trade and Development based in Canberra. Then we have Irfan Sheikh, and he is the President of the Federation of Pakistan Chambers of Commerce and Industry. And now his talk is going to be, and key things to watch there is the very fast changing and emerging digital environment that's coming. Finally, then we'll have Mohammed Karzai. Now we will be not using any slides or whatever, but he's currently the Secretary General of the Iranian National Committee of the International Chamber of Commerce. Now, importantly, if you look there on his bio note, that he was Vice President of UNICEF. He's been an ambassador there for Iran to the United Nations, and he was also President of the Board of the UNDP. So he's very well experienced, and you can ask him any question at all that you would like. Now, but first, let me go back to our first speaker, the Honourable Dan Tehan. And Dan, I'd like to invite you up to the podium to address us. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. And can I say it is great to be here this morning. I've flown in from Canberra on a 6 o'clock flight to be here because I just think it's incredibly important that we are having these conversations. And can I commend CACCI for ensuring that we continue to put trade policy and the importance of trade investment liberalisation on the agenda, because the headwinds are against us. And all of us have to understand that, we have to admit it, and we have to make sure that we're doing everything we can to turn the tide. What is happening is the geostrategic environment has changed. We are in a geostrategic environment where competition, global competition for power is preeminent. The world has changed. We have moved from a unipolar world where we had the US as the main driver and underpinning the world trade system and the momentum that we were making towards trade and investment liberalisation, to now a multipolar world where countries, nations have shifted and there is a balance of power competition taking place. Now, for those of us who believe in the fundamentals of trade and investment liberalisation and what it will do to global growth and lifting people from poverty right across the globe, we have to make sure that we continue to sell the message of the importance of trade and investment liberalisation. And in my view, I think we need to do it in every forum that we possibly can. Now, Andy has done some great work in achieving a successful world trading system, in particular pointing to the importance of the World Trade Organisation to achieving that. But as all of us know, to make progress at the WTO at the moment, you need every single country to agree before you can make progress. Now, that creates a level of difficulty, especially at the moment, which is very, very difficult to meet. 13 months ago, at the G20 in Italy, I was sitting around the table with Valdis Dombrovskis, the chief negotiator from the EU, with Piyush Goyal, my very good friend from India, the Chinese ambassador, the Brazilian trade minister, Catherine Tai, the US trade representative, and we were trying to reach agreement on what we could do to progress MC12. Now, the thing that was overhanging all of us at that time was the global pandemic. It was the first time that leaders had come together after the global pandemic, and that was what was front of mind with the conversation. Now, that is going to continue to happen. Every time we want to put trade at the forefront of what we're trying to do, outside events are also going to wash over us. And trying to make sure that trade and investment liberalisation stays at the heart of what we're trying to do is getting more and more difficult. And it's not just at the World Trade Organisation. When you're looking at undertaking plurilateral agreements, free trade agreements, it's a similar thing. Countries are wanting to put more and more other things into free trade agreements, and that makes it more and more difficult. When I negotiated the Australia-UK free trade agreement, I jokingly said to Liz Truss, my counterpart, well, why don't we put an agreement in as well that we would have a 6th test match between Australia and England in every Ashes series, because they were trying to put more and more into that agreement. So what we've got to do is make sure that when it comes to trade and investment liberalisation, we keep that at the core of everything we're doing. Now, these are my suggestions when it comes to what we need to be looking at to get the outcomes that we need. When it comes to the World Trade Organisation, Andy has some very good recommendations in his work. But I think the most important thing that we need to be pushing for, and remembering that one of the key outcomes from MC12 was that we need to look at reform of the WTO. Well, one of the key things we need to look at is to enable plurilaterals within the World Trade Organisation, which countries can sign up to, and then they remain open for other countries to join. So you're not held back by having to get every single country to agree to the progress that you want to make. So, for instance, when it comes to e-commerce or digital trade, what you could do is have an agreement where you might be able to get 70 or 80 countries to agree to, and then it remains open for every other single country to join up to. And that, I think, is a key way that we could start to make progress. We also need to ensure that all of us put all our efforts into making sure when it comes to the trade dispute settlement that we can get it back on track and get every country agreeing as to how we can settle trade disputes again. From an Australian point of view, one of the things that I think we also need to be looking at is how we can get the US, the United States, back engaged in the Indo-Pacific. Now, I think there are two key ways that we can do that. One is when it comes to CPTPP, the standard, what I think is the best standard free trade agreement in the Indo-Pacific, we have to keep encouraging the US to join CPTPP. Now, that is going to continue to be difficult given the domestic climate in the United States, but we have to keep encouraging them to be a part of that agreement and to show their trade and liberalisation credentials in the Indo-Pacific region. Because without the US participating, others will seek to fill the void, and we need the US engaged in the Indo-Pacific. The other area where I think, and especially Australia, can play a key role is that we have established the Quad, India, Japan, the US and Australia, as a key strategic grouping for the Indo-Pacific. Now, the Quad's aim is to create a prosperous Indo-Pacific region. Now, if you were to encourage a prosperous Indo-Pacific region, you need trade and investment liberalisation as part of that. So I think from an Australian point of view, we should begin to start advocating that the Quad look more and more at what it can do in the trade and investment area. And one of the things that I would love to see Australia propose, and this is something that you would need to work at over time, is our ultimate aim would be to see some sort of free trade agreement between Quad members. Now, Australia could be at the forefront of this because we have free trade agreements with the US, with Japan, and now with India. India has a free trade agreement with Japan. Japan has a free trade agreement with the US. And so there is the basis there to start bringing the four economies together. And from an Australian point of view, think of what it would mean. Because in terms of global economic weight, obviously when it comes to, on a GDP basis, on a nominal GDP basis, US #1 economy in the world, Japan #3, India #5. When it comes to economic rate on a pricing parity, US 2, Japan 3, India 4. So the economic weight that would bring is enormous. And I think Australia needs to start sowing the seeds to look and see how we can develop that. And then down the track, as Andy has recommended, one of the things we need to then start thinking about is how we can look at the advances that we've made in FTAs, in plurilaterals globally, to start to see how we can then uniformly start bringing more and more countries into those agreements and slowly, in particular, getting rid of the rules of origins and other areas that turn FTAs into blocks of trade. But that is going to take an enormous amount of time and is going to, in the end, be determined by whether we can start shifting the globe from the geostrategic competition that it is now facing to an approach where we all understand, and this is what I will conclude on, that trade is God's diplomacy. As Cobden said, if you can get countries trading, free commerce between nations happening, that is the best way that you can create prosperity between all nations and prosperity for the globe. I thank you for inviting me to be here this morning, and can I thank you again for putting this conference on, because what you are discussing is absolutely essential for the future prosperity of the globe. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Shadow Minister there. That was terrific. There were a lot of very important messages there, and now we're open to questions. And while you're getting yourselves organised on that question, you mentioned one of the things there was the importance of the United States and, you know, trying to engage them. And maybe one of the ways is through the Quad and whatever, and you've got the TPP. But frankly, they're still going the other way. You know, the barriers on chips, exports, etc., you know, that's getting worse, and that's going to have repercussions right around the globe. There's been no unwinding of any of those trade war barriers that President Trump put on. And now we're entering another potential trade war on electric vehicle subsidies, you know, with Europe. And the Europeans are quite rightly upset with this. So is the Quad the only way to get the US engaged? I mean, do you have any other comment on that?
Well, Andy, it is a really good question, and you're absolutely right. In terms of protectionism, since Trump, the US has gone backwards. Yes. There's no question. They're becoming more and more protectionist. Now, my hope is that this will begin to shift over time, but it will only shift if we're there continually making the arguments. And I just think we've got to use every argument that we have to try and shift the narrative. And if it is a strategic argument that we've got to use, then we have to use it, because that's about all we've got at the moment. Other than that, you know, the cupboard is almost bare, because the domestic climate from both the Republicans and the Democrats at the moment is one that ultimately is a trade is bad argument. And so we have to be there just putting the case and continually putting the case and using every way that we can to do it. Because if we don't, the US are going to become more and more isolationist, and we know that the US history is that they do have periods of isolationism, and if we're not there putting the case in particular for the peace and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific, we need US engagement, then I think we're going to see that more and more a retreat. What I would say at the moment is more economic isolationism than strategic isolationism. We're really seeing US policy in two parts at the moment. I think strategically they do see the importance of wanting to be engaged, but I think at its heart at the moment we're seeing a real economic isolationist tendency, which I think does the globe no favours, and in particular from an Australian point of view does us no favours.
Okay, thank you. Questions now. There was a hand up here for a question, was there? Or?
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I think that your enlightenment is very helpful to me to understand the general situation regarding the so-called international trade and the investment situation. But I got a question is that at the beginning, you talk about the WTO reform. And you said probably that's a good idea. If we expansion of so-called the pluralism, then probably we can invite generate the effect of inviting more WTO members to join. But talking about the pluralism, that's many people they worried about so-called free riders. Because like the ITA, you know, the information technology agreement. So nowadays probably out of the WTO 164 members, probably only 50 something members join the ITA agreements, so-called the ITA 2. And the rest of that, they also enjoy the so-called the ITA agreements, the lowering the tariff rates. So those free trade, the riders, many people the worried about if we join this pluralism and the benefits of the liberalization, trade liberalization will apply to those the participants. So did you have any comments on that? And also, because when we're talking about the IPEF, we all understand that's regarding some regulations, standards, but there is no market access. So that if there is no market access, because people eyeing on the US markets, if there's no market access, how can we attract the other members to join this IPEF? So I got those two questions. Yeah, thank you.
So they're two very good questions, and I'll deal with the first to start with. What you have to understand, and this is the work that Andy has done, which I think is incredibly significant, is that when you open your economies and you trade freely, it benefits consumers, it benefits business in your economy. And we've got to remember that as a fundamental point of trade. So when we enter into plurilaterals, you need to do your economic analysis, but you've also got to understand that if you can get agreement, and especially agreement amongst the major economy, to liberalise, then even though there will be some free riders, your economy is still going to benefit from that. And so you need to be doing that economic analysis. You need to be able to be ensuring that you're continuing to argue and put the case as to why trade benefits nations. And for those free riders, they might benefit, and if they do benefit, hopefully then that will lead them to signing up. But if you have good trade agreements in place, then your people of your nation will benefit. Hopefully that will see global growth benefit, and then more people will want to join and be a part of your agreement. So I think it's just a matter of doing the economic analysis, doing the work, and being able to convince people and put compelling arguments as to why trade benefits all, lifts all boats. I think that's the point that we have to keep making there. When it comes to IPEF, you are right that at the moment what we're seeing with IPEF is that the US in particular want to see agreements around standards, around rules, but there isn't the trade and investment liberalisation to go with it. Now, if you're a country looking at that, you'll be saying, well, why do I just want to sign up to your rules if there is ultimately no carrot at the end with trade and investment liberalisation? Now, my hope, and I must say as Trade Minister, I very much pushed the US to look at IPEF. My hope was that at least one key part of that would be that we would have a Indo-Pacific digital trade agreement, so that at least we would see liberalisation in the digital trade area. And my hope is that over time, that will be the one key area that the US will say, okay, yes, we are prepared to have very good trade and investment rules when it comes to digital trade as part of IPEF. Otherwise, all you have is the US pretty much saying to countries of the Indo-Pacific, join up because you can then have the rules that we enjoy. But when it comes in particular to trade and environment, for those developing countries as part of IPEF, they're not going to readily sign up to rules which potentially they lose comparative advantage on if they don't get market access into the US. So I think it's going to reach a stage where its utility will become questionable unless ultimately there is some market access with IPEF.
Thank you, Dan. That was a very good point you make about gaining yourself. The analysis actually shows 80 or 90% of the gains from trade liberalisation accrue to yourself. There is no free rider problem, really. Trade is win-win. Both parties gain, and if you liberalise, you mostly gain yourself. If you do the numbers, that's what it shows. Ken, you had a question.
In court from Perth, the big state, the free traders. I heard Paul talking about Victoria being big. For those Indians present, they might like to know that our state, Western Australia, is only a little bit smaller than all of India. We only have 2.5 million people. Then Bretton Woods was the father and beginning of globalisation, and it happened in the shadow of World War II. You can see something similar now, that the WTO has it's spread its wings so far. It's ineffective. And even at the G7 meeting, they said it needs major change or start again. It's, having been involved in it, it takes many years to get a decision, then goes to appeal, and no one takes any interest anyhow. So you might as well have a simple system that makes a quick decision, and if that country gets 5 or 6 red crosses, then we know it's not a good partner to trade with. I'm just trying to simplify the thing and think the present political and economic environment, following COVID and what's happening in Europe and other places, is the ideal environment to start again and to have a completely new international discussion on the trade issue. So.
Yeah, look, good question. I don't think it is to start again, because the World Trade Organisation, the global trading rules that we have in place now, I think have taken so long and so much time and effort to put in place now that if you decided to start again, I think countries would start walking back from those commitments that they've already made. I think that what we need to do is we do need to look at reform, we do need to look at a complete reset, but we have to make sure that we cement the existing arrangements that we have in place, because we are seeing some countries already trying to game that. So we've got to make sure that they stop doing that and hold them to account. And I think that is absolutely, fundamental to the WTO's success. That's why we need a functioning trade dispute mechanism, and we've got to get that sorted in the next couple of years. If we don't do that, then I think we will see more and more countries say, well, we can break the rules with impunity because there is no way known that we're really going to be hurt, or there is no pressure that then can be put on us. So I think we've got to cement the rules that we have and then look at reform on top of it. And I think the only way that we can do that, and it goes to the point that I was making in my address, is to say to those countries that do want to press ahead with trade and investment liberalisation, you should be allowed to do so, but you have to do so on the basis that when others see that you have benefited from it, that they can join. We've got to be exemplars, we've got to lead. And if you look at the Australian economy, we have shown that if you liberalise, if you open your economy, you benefit from it. You look at where the globe's heading at the moment, it's highly likely that Australia won't go into recession where the US, the EU and other countries will. Now, if you step back and ask, well, why won't we? Well, yeah, unless the Labor government heads us there unnecessarily. You're right, Ken, but I won't make this political. But if you look at the reason why we shouldn't go into recession, it's basically because we have such an open economy which will enable us to continue to trade our way through the current global downturn. And that's because we're so open. And, you know, we can be an exemplar in saying to other countries, this is what it does to you. I mean, it was the discussions that I had when negotiating the UK FTA and the Indian FTA, one of the key arguments that I could continue to put is, look at how Australia has benefited from being such an open economy. And if you can take the hard decisions to open your economy, ultimately in the long run, it will benefit your people. And I think we've got to continue to make that case because we are a beneficiary of our open economy.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, another questions from the floor here? Because I had one other one there just following up on the plurilaterals, right? Obviously, you don't want to be held up by the slowest ship in the convoy, no. So plurilaterals make sense. And then the key thing, of course, for that to work is that they're open. Others can join too, as you correctly say, and that's a really good point. The question is, what is the degree of acceptance of that? At the moment, because of the bilateral regionalism, etc., and the idea of this false notion of that exports are good and imports are bad, which is wrong, that people want to try and exclude, having gone to the trouble of liberalising. So is the openness really an open plurilateral agreement? How popular is that?
Well, there are some who say that, no, you need to stick to the concept at the WTO that all members have to agree. And so there is a real battle going on at the moment within the WTO as to whether we should head down the plurilateral path or whether every member needs to agree before anything's agreed. So I think this is a battle we have to win.
Right. Because
if we don't, I think progress in the WTO, some would say it's glacial at the moment.
Right.
It will become worse than glacial. I can't think of the word that you would use to describe that, but that is it will become worse than glacial.
Right.
And so I think this is a really important battle, and I think, you know, if all the chambers of commerce globally could play any role, I think it would be convincing every country that plurilateral pathway at the WTO is the way we need to go. And then what you can start to do is look at where all the regional trade agreements, look to see where you have consistency, and then you can start to say, well, if we start having plurilaterals at the WTO, countries have already undertaken this type of trade reform, and then you seek to start making sure that you can globally put in place the liberalisation that you need. We have to get really, really creative because the forces are against us at the moment. They really are against us.
All right, I've got a question over here from Brian Clark.
Stan, really great discussion. I'd like to bring it back perhaps closer to your current portfolio interests at the moment. And we've seen through COVID, lots of the people-to-people links have stopped. You know, and so I wanted to ask you a question around the importance of rebuilding the people-to-people links in how do we progress things together. And, you know, Australia still doesn't have entirely open arrangements. Many other countries don't either. It's certainly better than it was, but not back to where we hoped it would be. We need to get the students back, we need to get the tourists back, as well as the business people back. And I think even with this own conference, we had difficulty with some people getting in with visas and other bits and pieces. What's your suggestions on what have we got to do around rebuilding the people-to-people links, and particularly getting the business people to get in and out of countries quickly, to respond to the commercial opportunities, as well as the political requirements, etc.?
Well, it's a really good question, and I think this is one of the unique advantages Australia has in negotiating bilateral free trade agreements, is that we can use them to enhance those people-to-people links. Very difficult to do it at a global scale because of scare campaigns that will be run by unions and others around movement of people-to-people links, but you can do it bilaterally. So one of the things as part of the UK FTA we were able to do was to put people-to-people movement clauses in there. In particular, anyone under the age of 35 can now travel freely and work for up to 3 years between Australia and the UK. Now, that I think is very important for the relationship between Australia and the United Kingdom, because it will mean that young Brits and young Australians continue to know and understand the historical legacy and the importance of the bilateral relationship that the Australia and the UK has. But in a similar way, we were able to put people-to-people links in the Australia-India Free Trade Agreement and begin to start developing closer ties into how we can move people between Australia and India. Now, we had to be, for domestic political reasons, we couldn't be as adventurous as we were with the Australia-UK Free Trade Agreement, but we were able to put clauses in there which means that the temporary movement of people between Australia and India was enhanced, and in particular, Indian students who come and study here in Australia and those that studied and got first-class honours in their degrees, they are able to stay longer and work longer here in Australia. Now, those types of advancements, I think, over time will improve those people-to-people links, and if we are able to upgrade the Australia-India FTA, I think this is an area that we would be able to look at again. So I think we have a strategic advantage here that we can use, and we should be using them when it comes to people-to-people links in these agreements.
Okay, thank you.
Just before you do, Andy, can I just say thank you for what you have done over a long period of time to advance trade and investment liberalisation globally. Andy is one of the intellectual powerhouses when it comes to trade and investment liberalisation, and what you have done here in Australia and globally is absolutely to be commended, and it's great to be here with you today.
Thank you, Dan.
My name is Henrik Isaksson, and I am the Director of Trade Policy at the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise in Stockholm. I was invited as a guest speaker to the conference, but unfortunately I couldn't make it. So instead I'm giving a 10-minute presentation sent to you by video link from Sweden. So the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise is a business organization representing the entire business community except the financial sector. Every other branch of the economy, small and large businesses, are members in our organization. We have approximately 60,000 member companies organized in 15 different sectorial organizations. And in a wider European perspective, we are members of the Business Europe organization representing the entire European business community. And the topic that I was invited to speak about was the defensive nature of EU trade policy for the moment, and how that might affect companies in your part of the world, because it will affect companies in your part of the world for sure. There are many things going on in Europe, and some of them we're not very happy about. Other developments we fully understand whether they're taking place or even support them. But some of it might not be on your radar screen yet, and that's why I'm having this brief presentation. So Up until recently, most focus in trade policy was to how to achieve market access, either to the WTO or in free trade agreements. That's not so much the focus anymore because many of the roads ahead of us are blocked for various reasons. So the focus is on developing unilateral EU trade policy. For a range of reasons, that doesn't have to do with market access. It has to do with leveling the playing field, so we have fair trade instead of free trade. It has to do with security, and it has to do with ethical concerns and sustainable development. And these are some of those initiatives. And sanctions is, of course, one thing. Harsh sanctions against Russia, and more recently also against Iran. I'm not going to go deeper into that. Then we have FDI screening, which is becoming more and more prevalent in Europe as different countries in Europe, including my own Sweden, develops new ways of screening and potentially stopping FDI that we don't want. Not for economic reasons, not for protectionist reasons, but for reasons that has to do with security. It might become harder to invest in some European countries in some sectors in the future. We have something called the enforcement regulation in Europe, which normally deals with how we impose tariffs when we're in a trade conflict with the country. That regulation has recently changed, so it's now possible to use also services trade and intellectual property rights as weapons in a trade conflict. Exactly how that's going to work, will work, we don't know, but it might affect some firms in your part of the world in the future. We'll see. There is something called a foreign subsidy regulation, which is supposed to stop foreign firms that are state-owned or has the government backing them by subsidies from operating in the European market in order to level the playing field. This regulation will enter into force early next year, I think, and that's something that could be good to know. We have the international procurement instruments for those firms in your region that are interested in supplying the European procurement markets with goods and services. That might be harder if your own market is close to European firms, because if it is, the European Commission now has the authority to stop block bids from countries that are not seen as open to us as we are to them, meaning that in some cases the procurement market will be less open. Then we have something which is discussed very much around the world, which is CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which will probably enter into force on the 1st of January 2024, which is supposed to level the playing field between European producers and producers in third countries when it comes to some goods that are causing large climate emissions like aluminium, steel, fertilizers, etc. To export those goods to Europe will become considerably more expensive, and firms outside of Europe that are exporting those goods to the European Union will find themselves at a competitive disadvantage in order to level the playing field compared to European firms that already have to pay high costs for their emissions. Then we have something, three different initiatives that have to do with guarding the supply chain for more, shall we say, ethical reasons. Well, the first one is a deforestation initiative, which isn't in force yet, which is supposed to stop goods that are produced in areas which have been deforested from entering the European market. So it's not only timber, it could be coffee, cacao, soybeans, etc. Those goods will be blocked from entering Europe. Forced labor ban is another initiative that tries to ensure that goods that have been produced with forced labor cannot enter the European market, and if it does enter the European market, the goods will be withdrawn once it has been notified that have been produced by forced labor. And then the overarching initiative in this regard when it comes to supply chain is the corporate social sustainability due diligence. That's a long word. That's an initiative that is still being discussed, and we don't know how far-reaching it will be, but it will guard the entire supply chain, basically saying that a European firm that sources goods outside of Europe will have to make sure that their supplier and their supplier's supplier, etc., all the way along the supply chain, do not breach various fundamental human rights or environmental agreements in the production of the goods that we're talking about. Exactly how this is going to work, no idea, but it will be far-reaching, and it is the political initiative in Europe in this regard that is being most talked about, most controversial, because it will affect all firms, unlike some of the other initiatives that I talked about before, which will only affect some firms. You have the anti-coercion instrument, which is a very far-reaching tool that is also not operational yet, but which will empower the European Commission to wield much larger powers than I have today if they are in a trade conflict with a third country. So it will give them basically anything that's practically and legally possible to do, the European Commission will be able to do, even if the majority of the member states are even opposed to it. That is set up to give the Commission a muscular approach when approaching China and the US, perhaps, and other countries where we might find ourselves in a conflict with in the future. It's a bit like a trade policy nuclear weapon from our perspective, and we're quite worried about it. Then we should also mention that there is a range of initiatives that are being developed in Europe right now in the digital sphere. I'm not sure if you heard of them. You might have heard of the GDPR, which is for data privacy in Europe, but there's also something called the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act. Those are enforced very recently. The AI Act, which is Artificial Intelligence Act, and the Data Act. All this legislation will basically force companies that are doing any kind of digital trade with Europe to obey to these rules. That will force the firms to make various investments. Once they've made those investments, they might as well use their new business models in the rest of the world as well. And then we have something called the Brussels effect, which basically means that the rules and regulations that apply in the EU that are decided in Brussels have a global impact far outside of Europe. This has been proven academically to be the case, and I certainly think that in the area of digital trade, it will be the case. Now, the conclusion of all this is like a tsunami or an avalanche of various trade policy initiatives, is that there is more political interference in trade. It will be more expensive. It will be more cumbersome to trade with Europe because of new administration and the costs imposed by the regulations themselves. There will be more risks because of the conflicts that might arise when these instruments are enforced. And it requires new competences in the firms to deal with that. And this is something that is a new reality that you might look upon from various perspectives as a sign of progress. Globalization 2.0 is something good, or it's something horrible, or something in between, but it is a new reality that firms all over the world, including your part of the world, must take into account when trading with Europe. And on that note, thank you.
Well, that was a very good presentation there, and he certainly mentioned a lot of those issues in terms of political interference in trade, and I'm sure we'll come back to that in a minute. But now it's my pleasure to invite Brian Clark up as
Thanks very much, Andy, and it's a pleasure to be back and invited to speak, even though my role is no longer with the Chambers of Commerce, but it gives me a little bit of licence to be more reflective, perhaps, than I have been before. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time this morning just going through two things with you and then relating it back to the work that we did with the Achieving World Trading System, a successful trading system work. So a few things, see, there we go, right, got it right. So you may or may not be able to read this very well. It's a problem of having to strip something from a thing, but PwC in 2013 did a report which had quite an impact on me, which is called The World in 2050. And they had a look, they used the International Monetary Fund figures to make some assessments around where various countries are likely to be by 2050. And of course that was pre-COVID and pre the Russia conflict going on, a few other things there. But what you can see is they've developed a nice little mapping system, if you like, of where the countries are going to be. The red lines are countries who maintain or improve their position over the course of the next couple of decades, and the grey lines are those who decline in that. So what we can see, I've just circled there CACCI members. There are 14 CACCI members. This is the ranking of countries by purchasing power parity in that time in their assessment. And so you can see where a number of CACCI members are. It's very good that they're in the list of 20 countries which are there. Australia is obviously part of it. But by the time you move across to the 2050 group too, it's continuing to be pleasing that they all remain there. But a number of countries change their positions quite rapidly and dramatically. So just to call a couple out from there, as the report does, is Vietnam, the Philippines and Nigeria are some of the fastest movers. They're expected to have been before COVID hit. Now we have obviously those, what the situation is now, I will come to in a little bit later, but we hope that that trajectory is returned to as quickly as possible. But you'll note that Australia moves from 19th to 28th. And so the slide of Western or major developed countries, if you like, is a little bit evident in some of this and worrying for Australia in where do we get to if our policies of the time were continued. Right. There we go. So looking at those things and where they were then and where they are, or the projections for it, China, of course, continues to move up. The United States in relative performance moves down, the European Union moves down, and India moves up. And when you combine some of those things together, you can see that in 2016, as those figures were done for, the United States and the EU represented 31% of global GDP by purchasing power parity. And around 2050, they're expected to be about 35%. So again, you see that shift. And John Denton didn't mention it in his speech, but he was responsible as well in an earlier Australian government for a report which is called Australia in the Asian Century. And that was highlighting again the growth and the importance of Asia and how we can't miss that as an opportunity for our own nation. But it's just reinforced here around how important it is that Asia was expected before to surpass the traditional Western countries, if you like, and at scale. So this was another important point which was raised at that time, again highlighting the growth of emerging economies as they were described then. So China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Russia, Mexico and Turkey in the E7, as it was described, against the G7, who gets all the publicity. And so the G7, in 1995, the emerging countries in that grouping were about half the size of those nations in the G7. By 2015, it was around the same size, but you didn't get the same sort of media coverage associated with it. And by 2040, so 25 years hence, since the report, or forecast from the report, the E7, India, China, Indonesia, Brazil, Russia, Mexico and Turkey, would be twice the size of the G7. So you can see where these power shifts are going to come from and who's writing the rules for various things becomes important. Now, I'm very pleased I've used this. We have the president of the UNDP amongst us, which is terrific. But I've come across this report recently. This is 2022 now, so I thought, well, what have we got that we can juxtapose a pre-COVID report with? And so the United Nations Development Programme put this report out just recently around 2050 by their set of measures around sustainable development and the UN development goals. And they referred to this as the Great Upheaval. And I actually have read an earlier book called The Great Upheaval, but it was around the French Revolution, French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the demise of the Ottoman Empire and Russian Tsar system at the time. But I was attracted to this. It's a weighty tome. I haven't read every word of it, but it's 400 and something pages. But I did pull out a few things which just leapt at me at the time. And a few things here is they point out, for example, and a little like our earlier speakers today have pointed out, that over the past 200 years, poverty has been reduced from 9 people in 10. So 200 years ago, 9 in 10, 90% of the population lived in poverty, to now 1 in 10. And we did that with the addition of 6.5 million people, mainly in Asia. That should be billion people, sorry, billion people, mainly in Asia, did that. And so, as we saw today, trade is the greatest enabler of lifting people out of poverty that the world has ever seen. We need to really remember these things around what trade is for, right? It's not for somebody to commercially sell something to somebody else. It lifts economies, and we lift economies because people's lives improve. Those are the important things. The report goes on to highlight the climate threats. Again, in Asia, a lot of low-lying countries, a lot of population who are likely to be disaffected very seriously. Densely populated places as well, high dependency on natural resources and agriculture. They suggest that 1% of the current assets held by investors globally, that's pension funds and private investors and banks, etc., governments not so much, 1% of that would change and fill the financing gap for the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, this is an important point because, see, this is privately held money, and you have governments thinking about how they might access the privately held money to solve the problems which they're trying to deal with. You can think fairly quickly around governments are thinking of taxation or ways in which you shift wealth to things and sets of policies associated with that. So watch out for that, because it looks really simple. And 2.9 billion people remain unconnected to the internet. So while we talk about the digital economy and what we're going to do in other bits and pieces, we have to remember there's still 30% more or less of the world's population are not connected to that system. So let's make sure we don't also leave people behind as we're dealing with that. But they again suggest that $428 billion of investment would achieve universal broadband connectivity. And again, in the scale of global finance, that's not really that much. There's a few other things here. I don't intend to read all the slides, but I do want to point out a few things here. Well, obviously, the state of financial situation of any given country then changes the way that they can respond to external shocks like the pandemic and other things. So you can see here again issues around how the governments of the world approached COVID, as a global shock to them, have not necessarily been the things which have worked well, and we will learn more, of course, as we study the response mechanisms. But again, the capacity of each country to pay, for the response mechanisms that they need to do and the shifts of money around in order to do that are really important. But a lot of the things which have been put in place are not the things which are going to be most helpful. And we have to now wonder, how much did the fiscal stimulus around COVID now contribute to the current inflationary situation, and then the governments of the world are going to have to deal with that as well. They have some suggestions around how the institutional frameworks work together. And again, this is a point that we made in the report, or Andy made in the report, and we collectively were able to identify, is that you've got these institutions, and the institutions are all being asked to solve every problem in the world. And maybe that's not the best way to do it. Perhaps having, smaller platforms, which each of them are supposed to do, and more focused activities, and then having them collaborate together in some sort of potentially coordinating body, sitting across the top of it, so that you have the appropriate institution and the appropriate instrument for the problem at hand, rather than everyone trying to do everything and possibly not getting anywhere. Of course, you could make some analogy with the G20. The G20 was largely formed in the shadow of the financial crisis last century, but it's non-binding. Always the hope with that is that the countries can get together, their leadership can get together, and they make decisions, and they take those decisions forward into the binding forums, but it's not necessarily happening that well. So we can ask again, are our global institutions fit for purpose for the 21st century? And I think Ken's question, and Samir has previously publicly stated from a CACCI perspective, do we need a new Bretton Woods? Is there a way that we need to think around what the institutional frameworks for the world need to be for the next century, as opposed to just relying on the things which worked for the last century? And I'll come here, this is my last slide, you'll be pleased, Andy, but I can bring it back now to our report and have a look at this. So the importance of chambers of commerce and the importance of CACCI in trying to shape, what are the global institutional outcomes which are ultimately trying to benefit all of us in a living standards perspective. We identified that we probably were at a time of great upheaval, and at the time we wrote that, it was really around whether or not the WTO, had a viable future. Luckily, at MC12, they did sort of have a successful meeting. They didn't actually get to reform, but they agreed they should look at reform, so that's helpful. They did things on fisheries. They did, a few other things. So we need to be congratulatory of the work which is done, but that more needs to be doing. So don't take your foot off the accelerator. CACCI has started this as momentum. Let's build upon the momentum. We can ask if those institutional frameworks are fit for purpose for the 21st century. What does a rules-based order mean if you can't defend the rules? And if people ignore the rules and there is no consequence to that? How do we move forward? The Bretton Woods idea, when we were writing that paper, I went back and looked at how did that happen. We were dealing with a world in the ashes of the Second World War, and the change, in fact, from the empire, and particularly the British Empire, to the Americans being the dominant political force. In the end, they had the money and were on the right side of history. But it wasn't without a tussle. That didn't happen just because a group of people quickly came together. They were locked in rooms for months, trying to work it out with the best and brightest minds of the world, trying to work out what the best system was going to be to take us forward. Luckily, they came up with the solution. Are we at the time when we need to do that ourselves again to make sure that we've got the right thing? We'll find from a business perspective, businesses will be more risk averse. They've had blockages in supply chains. They'll try to maintain some of those things, but governments of the world are also that way. You can see it in the concepts. Firstly, it started as reshoring. Can you bring your industries back home? Well, that's just protectionism. And then it's now friendshoring, the term which I'm hearing. So, make sure that your supply chains are all linked to nations who are friendly with you. Well, that chops and changes. It's going to be something or other where you're going to have to be sure-footed around dealing with those things, but it may not be to your best advantage either. Businesses, of course, are going to have to be more resilient. They've learnt that a little bit. They're changing, they're evolving. Their business models are different than they were before. That will keep up, and I think digital and other technologies will also drive further changes that businesses are going to have to be agile around and dealing with. But what's certain in these two reports which I've reflected on is there is no stopping the move to Asia being, the centre of economic importance over the course of this next century. So we're even more likely to be in the Asian century than we were when those reports were written some time ago. So I'll leave it there and happy to have the conversation, Andy.
The fact that the E7 is going to be twice as big as the G7 is that's going to have huge implications for who gets to write the rules. And as you said, the importance of keeping the foot on the accelerator there is going to be terribly important. And there's still a long way to go. 30% of the world's population not connected to the internet is, that's a big challenge, isn't it? Anyway, what we'll do is we'll move directly to our next speaker, Irfan Sheikh. He's the president of the Pakistan Chamber of Commerce and Industry.
Thank you very much for inviting me as a speaker. In the session, the Evolving World Trading System Implications for Businesses of 36th CACCI Conference, I really appreciate the efforts of CACCI Secretariat and Victorian Chamber of Commerce and Industry for organizing this conference in benefiting manners. Now I should start the presentation. The Evolving World Trading System Implication for Pakistan for business. Evaluation of the world trading. Actually, it started in early 20th century with small businesses and general stores. During the 1980s, the businesses involved into separate stores in the likes of Walmart, Barnes and Nobles. The 1990s saw the emergence of tech boom with rising tech companies, Amazon and eBay. The tech boom transformed into a revolution within the 21st century with the use of e-commerce and modern tools. The World Trading Systems, what's in it for business? The World Trading Systems evolution has transformed how business was conducted. The 21st century saw the rise of global value chain as a separate entity of the global trading system. Businesses have started to look towards global sourcing to reduce costs and become more productive and innovative. The technological advancement also played an important role to secure market access and bringing stability to export markets. Global trends in world trade pre and post-pandemic. Global trade volume during COVID-19 suffered a massive decline from USD 49 trillion to USD 44 trillion. However, the post-COVID business has managed to gain sustainability and has reached USD 55 trillion. Technology shaping the business trends. After the pandemic and the global business trend transformed due to the advancement in technology and the need to conduct business virtually during severe lockdowns. Digital technology played a major role in responding to this crisis. The emergence of a new era with business to everyone, B2E, building everything around people. Large firms around the world have automated their businesses operations, value chains, branding, and advertisement strategies. The technological changes driven by COVID-19 led to industrial automation and contactless payments. Technology shaping the business trends. Major sectors which successfully managed to run themselves during the pandemic due to technology were industrial automation, food and agri-tech, healthcare, telehealth technology, retail enhanced e-commerce, fintech and branchless banking, food services, grocery deliveries, cloud kitchen. Rise of e-commerce post-COVID. E-commerce platforms also witnessed healthy growth after the pandemic, with their gross merchandise value improving from USD 1.6 trillion to 1.9 trillion globally. B2B and B2C companies managed to post 30% growth in 2019 and 20. From the previous year, Alibaba and Amazon continue to hold the top 2 position in the world in the e-commerce category. Evolving business trends in Asia post-COVID. According to the United Nations E-Governmental Survey 2022, the e-governmental index has improved slightly from 0.63 to 0.64 in the post-COVID scenario. However, the e-participation index went down from 0.59 to 0.45. Evolving business trends in Pakistan. Post-COVID business trend in Pakistan saw a rise of registered merchant by 2 times, which increases from 6,000 to 12,000. USD transactions also increased from USD 170 million to USD 370 million. Through digital platforms, further witness a rise from PKR 90 billion to PKR 141 billion, having growth of 56%. Evolving business trends in Pakistan post-COVID. Okay. Current challenges to private sectors in changing business trends. Due to the world trading system's continuous evolution, the developing world's private sectors would be bound to face various challenges in the future. Access to digital infrastructure and workforce with appropriate digital skills, creating sustainable financial instruments for digital transformation, reinventing entire business models to compete in an ever more digital world, investment in cyber security to mitigate the risks associated with potential loss of information, establishing robust legal framework for consumer protection. Role of WTO in empowering private sector. Guidance for adequate regulatory framework in the reducing the cost of doing business and facilitating relevant skills development. Number 2, awareness raising campaigns or capacity building, training and mentoring programs. Help to promote initiative and host events or provide expertise for institutional building, provide technical support to SMEs in developing countries, encourage entrepreneurship and startups, bridge the digital divide between rich and poor countries. Way forward for chambers and Chamber of Commerce. Investment in digital infrastructures and digital skills for the development of digital infrastructure services, encourage regional trade and global value chains, promote competition and encourage market deregulation, invest in human capital development, facilitate cross-border e-commerce for SMEs, create B2B platform to support SMEs internationalization, create funding platforms for SMEs and startups, support digital innovation hubs. Thank you very much.
Very much, Irfan. And I'd now like to welcome Mohammed Kazi up to the podium and give us his remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you and good morning. Thank you, Andrew, for giving me the floor. I'm really happy and delighted to be here today with you. So, as the Secretary General of ICC in Iran, it's a great pleasure for me to speak here in CACCI's meeting. And thank you, Mr. President, and your colleagues for all your efforts to organize this important meeting. In today's economy, which I would like to name it the post-COVID-19 era, we need recovery. Recovery from economic crisis, recovery from debt crisis of enterprises, and recovery from unemployment and poverty. This can be all achieved with the help of private sector, which brings new and innovative solutions to the market. International and regional institutions such as CACCI, ICC, and etc. play a significant role in supporting the private sector all over the world. They provide critical capital, knowledge, and partnership, help manage risks, and catalyze the participation of MSMEs in the economy. Just a couple of minutes ago, we heard from Mr. Clark about the importance of Asia in the coming decades, which would be the center of importance. So if it's true, which in my view is true, I think the role of CACCI would be much more important. And as somebody who works with ICC, with, of course, supporting what the statement made by John Denton, I believe the coordination and collaboration between CACCI and ICC must be much stronger than it is now, as I see it. Dear friends, chambers all over the world can create a coalition to boost the role of the private enterprises. This is what CACCI and ICC are doing their utmost for, but should do more. As the Secretary General of ICC in Iran, I am aware of the great work of ICC during COVID-19 pandemic to maintain the trend of global economy, but still a lot remains to be done. It is essential to preserve and improve trade environment with a stable, transparent, and fair trade rules that work for businesses of all sizes, especially SMEs, from unfair trading practices. As a regional organization, CACCI, as well as ICC-WCF, have an important role to play. CACCI's mission is to provide a platform for promoting the vital role of business in the region and enhancing regional economic growth. We all know that the global and regional role and responsibility of multilateral organizations is important in enhancing chambers of commerce activities through unifying legal and commercial procedure, creating a platform for trade and economic development, promoting knowledge in the sectors of trade, banking, communication, and financial issues. Distinguished guests, COVID-19 has presented both opportunities and challenges. What's important to pay attention is that the pandemic has had a huge influence on communication and trade systems in the world. In fact, it has been accelerating digitalization, as it was said before, in economy and procedures, in financial and banking relations as well. This transition, in one hand, is positive, but on the other hand, it is important to take into consideration the following two issues. First, we must establish updated legal frameworks, regulations, and principles. I have discussed this issue with John during a phone conversation a few months ago. Governing trade and investment, adapting to new conditions. Second, chambers of commerce should increase their knowledge and skills level. Institutional capacity building is one of the most important issues in the new age. I would like to emphasize on establishing closer collaboration among chambers, expanding sustainable business models, and accelerating digital transformations within businesses. Dear colleagues, rapid economic growth in developing countries has shifted a positive balance towards Asia and the Pacific region. However, the lack of adequate social policies, in one hand, and at the other hand, continued escalation of trade tensions would threaten jobs and growth in the world, but would hit poverty reduction initiatives. According to the United Nations Economic and Social Commission report, at a minimum, the Asia-Pacific region will face a net loss of about 2.7 million jobs. Unemployment losses will be 66% higher for unskilled workers if trade tensions are not resolved. Based on the report, protectionist regimes in the regional and global level does not fit in the 2030 agenda, especially goal number 17, which discusses the link between the Sustainable Development Goals and trade policy. This goal stresses the importance of a universal rules-based, open, non-discriminatory, and equitable multilateral trading system. The growing challenges for trade and investment call for necessary actions from all Asia-Pacific economies in the key areas such as investment and trade to ensure that trade and investment can be an effective vehicle to achieve sustainable development. I think it was emphasized by Honorable Minister talking before me. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take this opportunity to raise another important issue, which was mentioned by Mr. Henrik Isaacson before me, using the economic and trade mechanism and relations for political purposes. Dear colleagues, as you know, ICC was established 100 years ago after World War I, with the motto of trade for peace. When the human beings felt the danger of war, destruction of economies and businesses. The philosophy of establishing ICC, and I believe CACCI, was to make peace, security, sustainability through a consensus effort at the global level to facilitate trade and business relations among the nations. It is non-political characteristics its non-political characteristics is an outstanding point. But unfortunately, we see that the unilateral and illegal sanctions regime not only is an obstacle to trade expansion and peace for nations, but in addition, it will either destroy the private sectors of countries, of course, or cause serious damages to them and to the ordinary people who will be the most affected by sanctions. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I should use this opportunity to appreciate the CACCI for its main role in developing and promoting business in Asia-Pacific region, emphasizing that CACCI and WCF can work as an engine of ICC activities. Chambers of Commerce of Iran have always been an active member in CACCI's council. And I'm happy to announce that Dr. Yavari, the Vice President for International Affairs of Iranian Chamber of Commerce, was elected or appointed as a member of council and Vice President of CACCI for the next 2 years. Such meetings that bring together the economic authorities, intellectuals, and policymakers provide a basis for common thinking and empowerment of international institutions and private sector. Let's call to 2023 as the year for the rise of the innovative private sector. Thank you, Andrew.
Very much. And now we move into question time, and so get your questions together. But there are a few common themes there. And then, first of all, the importance of your private sector is well taken because, look, people have lost it. You know, fundamentally, all this international trade is simply commerce across borders, buying and selling across borders. And who knows most about buying and selling and commerce? The chambers of commerce. It's you people. And yet we're still in this position where the head of the WTO, Ngozi, is out here in Australia. She didn't get in touch with anyone from the Chamber of Commerce or seek any views or anything like that. And why not? So getting this voice heard is terribly, terribly important. And Brian said it then, keep the foot on the pedal. Anyway, questions for people, and I'm not sure, Irfan just had to apologise, he just had to duck out very quickly and he might be back, but his points about digital were very well made, and certainly Mohammed made them as well. So first question from anyone there?
Thank you, Andy. It's not a question, but it's going with your point of it's very important for chambers to come together.
Yeah.
And like Brian said, Asia is going to be the center point in the next century. And therefore the relevance of CACCI and all of you here is very pertinent that we all work at a common cause. And just like Andy said, the report that Andy put together for CACCI is basically emphasizing that the WTO's purpose was trade, not politics. And therefore our common goal here should be business as well and not politics. So we encourage all of you to support all of us here in the common cause of going forward.
Yeah, thank you. A question for you, Mohammed. I mean, you made that point about, commenting on Henry Isaacson's point he made in his video about the weaponisation of trade, and obviously Iran has been was one of the so-called recipients of that, and yet these trade sanctions don't really work. So how is that message going to get through that people are worse off at the end of the day, and it doesn't enhance peace by going down that route?
Of course, I'm not going to say how we we work on the sanction, because I should not reveal the secrets. But the point is, you are absolutely right. You are absolutely right, and I think all of us can see that sanctioning Iran has not been helping at all the peace and security in the region. And it's not going to work, in my view, doing with Russia, despite of what we think about Russian and Ukraine crisis. But sanction using economic and trade system against countries, at the end, the poor people and nations are suffered, as we have seen it in Iran, as I've seen it in some other places of the world. So you are absolutely right. I believe this is not the right policy. And here, that's why I mentioned the role of the ICC and CACCI, as President mentioned too, that we have to try to find a way to promote trade among nations. You may put pressure on governments, Andrew, through different ways and means, but nations and private sectors working together can help as we do it. So therefore, that's why, Andrew, I'm not going to talk here as ex-ambassador at the United Nations, which I was involved in some negotiations, but I would like to say that the best way was to keep GCPO alive and continue negotiation on that issue rather than imposing sanctions on poor people of Iran, which is not going to work.
Right, thank you. Brian, do you have any comment on that at all in terms of the politics and how to really overcome that issue?
Look, only I think Henrik's points are well made around how the trade issues are becoming weaponised, and Dan Tian's pointed it out too, is things which start as a conversation on trade then have other things conflated with it, and you can't deal with the trade until you deal with the other things, be they, gender equality or a whole lot of other things which are being attached to the trade issue. And we highlighted before is you can't solve some of these problems by looking at them through a trade lens. You've got to look at, the right tool with the right product at the right time.
Right. Okay. So next question, and certainly, look, please jump in with your questions. And yes, here's one down here at the front.
Yes, I have a question to Brian. Very thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation, and very informative. You talked about temporary debt relief to low-income countries, which were not very helpful to them. Do you think that writing off the debts will be instrumental in bringing them, to par?
Oh, look, it's an interesting question, and I guess I was reflecting on the report which came from the UNDP and their collection of thoughts from people much brighter than I am. But I'm not certain that's going to be the right way to go. If you relieve a country got into difficulties because of certain actions internally, mostly, and then if you forgive those borrowings, etc., for no particular reason, then you do allow those countries to reset for a period of time. But if the policies continue, all they do is return to the same position again over a different period of time. And if you're not getting the reform activities going on, if you're not getting the business activity, if you're not getting the investment attraction, etc., then you haven't reformed, the economies haven't reformed in the right way. So I think it's important that we don't necessarily have knee-jerk responses to things. They need to be thoughtful responses to things. And I do think maybe some debt relief could be helpful to some things, but it's got to be accompanied by a reform agenda internally by those countries to say things can't continue the way they were, and if there is a reward around changing the debt status, then fine, but you've also got to do the internal reform process that goes with that.
other questions, please go, because it's a bit, there's one right down the back there. Yes, please.
We actually cannot do anything about sanctions, but we can actually contribute or encourage the development of a parallel or alternative currency for global trade. My question to any one of the panelists, what do you think if there is an alternative petrodollar for trade? Will that help world economy or not?
Who wants?
Let me disagree that we cannot do anything about sanction. We can do. Because private sectors in every country, in US, in Iran, in Australia, in Europe, have a strong voice if they want to use it. We should not undermine the weight of ICC, CACCI, and similar institutions that they can affect politicians how to decide, even in my own country. So I disagree that we cannot do anything. Of course, it's not easy, but I believe that we can do. But on your point, I agree. It's an important point. Let me say, for the last couple of decades, which we have been under different type of sanctions in Iran, we are working with different countries. If you travel to Iran today, you may see inflation, but the market is open as it is here in Melbourne, and you do not see any say serious problem providing goods and capitals for people. Although the inflation is there, people are not in easy situation, but sanction was not able to block the way of trade between Iran and other countries in the region, neighboring countries. We can sell our oil, we can import things and export things. A good model with China was established, that the Conlon Bank was there to deal with Iran, and I don't want to go to details of that, but that model was working because we could work with China, and we did not have basically any problem. Using bilateral monetary system is also another way somehow to bypass sanctions and so many other ways. So therefore, I believe that promoting trade, especially in the age of digitalization of economy, would or may help. And we should not forget, as a CACCI or ICC or private sector, that sanction cannot stop trade. But the price of trade goes high. You do the trade more expensively. That's a problem. And it's not good for the private sector promotion and development. There are ways and means. I have not seen that paper, but I believe if I read it, I will find a good proposals for promotion of private sector and cooperation, which I hope that I can have a copy of it later on.
Yeah, I'll certainly give you a copy, and that's very good. I'm sorry that last question to the chair of the session, and that's me, and because we have to break for coffee and it is getting time, and it's just unfortunate that Irfan had to apologise and leave, because he made a very good point about the growth of the digital economy, etc., and we can all see that coming. But the trouble is that how on earth are we going to reconcile those different models that are out there for regulating the digital economy? Because while the digital has a lot of benefits, it's also misused. There's cybersecurity, there's, interfering with political elections in another country, etc., so there's a whole lot of misuse of this data, which then begets regulation. But the different models are in Europe. Data belongs to the individual. In America, data belongs to the company. In China, data belongs to the state. Now, how on earth is that going to get reconciled? Either a very quick question, then we'll break for coffee.
I think that's a question for an entirely other conference.
Well, it is, yeah.
Firstly, there is no such thing as the digital economy. There is only the economy in a digital age. So, secondly, people talk about data being the new oil. Data is what makes the world go around. So as the Industrial Revolution was based around petrochemicals mostly, the new coming evolution of our economy is going to be focused on data. The Europeans are having to face this around how do you manage the data the way they do. The Americans, quite rightly as you said, have got a different approach where it's privately held. But that held up. Have a look at the COVID responses. You know, the companies who held the IP were solving the problem, tried to retain it, and found that they couldn't. In the end, the government solved the opening of the doorway and the pathway so that vaccines and other things could be spread to the populace rather than, you know, and held hostage to the companies who held the IP. So I think we are going to have to find balances to these things. They are new challenges. We don't necessarily have that, and as each country does it. But what we are finding as well is this won't work if countries think they can control it themselves. You know, so national issues around where do you hold data and under what circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. It's important for some things, but it's not important for other things. And so we need to make sure that what we've got is all of the things that worked around trade and the movement of goods also applies to the digital age is becoming, and so movement of ideas, IP, information, et cetera, also need to be as free as it can be within the constraints necessary.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I better bring this session to a close. And just remains for me to thank you very much for participating. You've been the best audience I've had to work with in my entire career, so thank you very much.